My name is Linda, and for the last 20 years, I've worked as a supervisor at Hudson Manufacturing, a family-owned factory. I've seen people come and go, watched the company grow, and witnessed both kindness and cruelty unfold in its walls. But nothing prepared me for what happened when the owner's arrogant son took over. James Hudson Jr. had never worked a day in his life. He was raised in luxury, sent to the best schools, and traveled the world while his father, Mr. Hudson, ran the factory. But when the old man fell ill and had to step down, James was given control. The first time he walked into the factory, I could tell he wasn't like his father. Mr. Hudson had always been fair and treated everyone with respect. James, on the other hand, looked at the workers as if they were beneath him. He barely glanced at us when he passed by, too busy adjusting his expensive watch or checking his phone. And then there was Henry. Henry was one of our oldest workers, a quiet man, maybe in his late 50s, who always kept to himself. He wasn't the fastest worker, but he was steady, reliable. He had been here longer than me, but no one knew much about him. James noticed Henry within his first week. "Who's that old guy?" he asked me one afternoon, watching Henry move a little slower than the others. "That's Henry," I said. "He's been here for over 30 years. James frowned. "He looks lazy to me. Why do we even keep him?" I felt my stomach twist. Henry does his job well. He's never missed a day of work. James scoffed. "We need fresh blood in here, people who actually work hard, not some slow old man collecting a paycheck." I wanted to argue, to tell him that Henry had earned his place here. But I knew it wouldn't matter. James was the boss now. And just like that, Henry's days were numbered. The next morning, James called for a meeting in the break room. We all knew something was coming. Ever since he took over, he had been walking around with a clipboard, making notes, whispering with his assistant. When we all gathered, he stood in front of us, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit like he was about to make a grand announcement. "I've been evaluating the productivity of this factory," he began, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And I've noticed some inefficiencies. If we want to stay competitive, we need to make changes." I felt the air grow tense. The workers looked at one another, worried. We had all seen how cold and ruthless James could be. Then he turned his gaze to Henry. "Some of you have been here for a long time," James continued, "and while loyalty is nice, it doesn't pay the bills. We need workers who can keep up with modern industry standards." My chest tightened. I knew what was coming. "Henry," James said, not even bothering to soften his tone, "it's time for you to retire." The room fell silent. Henry looked up slowly, his weathered hands gripping his lunchbox. His face didn't show much emotion, but I saw the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers trembled. "Sir, I don't want to retire," Henry said quietly. "I still need this job." James sighed, like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You've had a good run, but it's time to move on. We'll give you a small severance package, but as of today, you're done." I clenched my fists. "James, this isn't right," I said, unable to hold back anymore. "Henry has been here longer than anyone. He deserves better than this." James turned to me with a smirk. "This is business, Linda. If we keep dead weight, we all sink. It's time to be smart." Henry didn't argue. He simply nodded, picked up his old brown coat, and walked out. No goodbyes, no fight, just silence. I watched him go, my heart aching. James thought he had won, but he had no idea who Henry really was, and soon he would regret everything. After Henry left, the factory didn't feel the same. There was a heaviness in the air, like something was missing. People whispered about what had happened, shaking their heads in disappointment. Even the machines seemed to hum a little quieter. James, of course, didn't care. He walked around like a king, proud of his decision. "Tough choices make successful businesses," he said when I confronted him again. "We can't afford to be sentimental." I wanted to tell him that loyalty wasn't a weakness, that treating people like family was what had kept this factory running for decades. But James wouldn't listen. A few days later, something strange happened. A black luxury car pulled up outside the factory. I had never seen anything like it, sleek, expensive, the kind of car only CEOs or millionaires drove. It sat there for a few minutes before the driver, a man in a crisp suit, stepped out. He looked around before walking straight toward the office. James was in the middle of bragging about his cost-cutting strategies when the man entered. His smile faded the moment he saw the visitor. Mr. Hudson, the man said, his voice sharp. My name is Richard Wells. I need to speak with you immediately. James straightened his posture, clearly confused, but trying to look important. Of course. And you are? The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a folder and placed it on James's desk. James opened it, and within seconds, the color drained from his face. I had never seen him speechless before. Curious, I stepped a little closer. My eyes landed on the papers inside, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a document. Not just any document, it was ownership papers. Henry's name was on them, and in bold letters it read, Majority Shareholder of Hudson Manufacturing. I turned to James, whose hands were shaking. This must be a mistake, he stammered. Richard Wells shook his head. It's not. He looked around the office, then at me. Where is Mr. Henry Walker? My heart raced. Henry? Mr. Walker? I thought back to all those years of seeing him work quietly, never demanding anything, never acting like he was above anyone. And now I was realizing we had never truly known who he was. But one thing was clear. James had just fired the one man who had more power than him. And Henry had let him do it without saying a word. James looked like he had seen a ghost. His hands gripped the edges of his desk as he flipped through the papers again, his eyes darting across the legal documents that proved without a doubt that Henry Walker, the man he had just fired, was the real owner of Hudson Manufacturing. This has to be some kind of joke, James muttered, his voice weak. Henry was just a worker. Richard Wells sighed, as if he had been expecting this reaction. Mr. Walker isn't just a worker, he's the largest shareholder of this company. In fact, your father, Mr. Hudson Sr., sold him those shares nearly 30 years ago. I gasped. 30 years ago? That meant Henry had been part of this company long before James was even old enough to understand business. But why? James blurted out. Why would my father sell shares to him? Richard gave James a pointed look. Because Henry Walker saved this factory once. Decades ago, when your father was struggling to keep the business afloat, Henry stepped in. He had some savings, enough to buy shares and help fund operations. But he never wanted power or recognition. He just wanted to work. I felt my knees go weak. Henry had been here all this time, working side by side with us, while secretly holding more power than anyone else in the room. James swallowed hard. So why didn't he ever say anything? Richard shrugged. He never cared about titles. He believed in hard work, in loyalty. He let your father run the factory while he stayed in the background. And when your father passed it down to you, he chose to stay silent. Until now. James looked sick. So what does this mean? Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. It means that you, Mr. Hudson, just fired the majority owner of this company. And now, we wait to see what he wants to do about it. A heavy silence filled the room. James had made a terrible mistake. And the worst part? Henry hadn't even tried to stop him. He had simply left, knowing exactly what would happen next. And now, we were all waiting for his next move. For the next few days, the factory was tense. Everyone knew something big was happening, but no one knew what. James locked himself in his office, making frantic phone calls, probably trying to figure out a way to fix his mistake. But there was nothing he could do. Henry had all the power now. Then, on Friday morning, it happened. A familiar old brown coat entered the factory. Henry was back. He walked in like he always had, calm, quiet, with that same steady presence. But this time every eye was on him. Whispers spread like wildfire. James came rushing out of his office the moment he saw him. "Henry, wait," he called, his voice almost desperate. Henry stopped but didn't turn around right away. He took his time, looking around the factory at the workers, at the machines he had spent decades tending to. Finally he turned to face James. "You shouldn't be here," James said, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked. "You don't work here anymore." Henry gave a small smile. "Actually," he said, pulling a folded document from his pocket, "I do." James snatched the paper and scanned it. His face drained of all color. It was a legal notice. Effective immediately, Henry Walker was resuming his role as the majority shareholder, which meant James had no authority over him. I watched as realization hit James like a brick wall. He wasn't in control anymore. Henry was. James forced a laugh. "Okay, fine, you own shares, but that doesn't mean you can just walk in here and—" "Actually, it does," Richard Wells interrupted, stepping inside. He had arrived right behind Henry, briefcase in hand. Henry has the right to make decisions about this company, and after what you did, he's decided to make some changes. James scoffed. What changes? Henry's face remained calm. You're fired. The factory went silent. James blinked. You can't do that, he snapped. I can, Henry said simply, and I just did. James looked around, expecting someone to step in, to take his side. But no one did. Not the workers, not the managers, not even me. Because after everything, he had done this to himself. You treated these people like they were nothing, Henry continued, his voice steady. You didn't respect the factory, the workers, or the legacy your father built. You thought you could walk in and make decisions without understanding what this place really means. James clenched his jaw. You're making a mistake. Henry shook his head. No. You made the mistake. For the first time, James had nothing to say. He looked at me, then at the workers, then back at Henry. And when he realized no one was coming to his defense, he exhaled sharply, grabbed his things, and stormed out. Just like that, he was gone. And for the first time in weeks, the factory felt like home again. After James walked out, the factory floor was quiet. No one cheered, no one clapped, but there was a shift in the air. A weight had been lifted. Henry stood there for a moment, looking around at all of us. His hands were still rough from years of work, his old brown coat still draped over his shoulders. He hadn't changed. And that was the thing about Henry. He never needed power to prove his worth. Then finally, he spoke. I never wanted to run this place, he admitted, his voice steady. I was happy working alongside you all, but when I saw what was happening, I couldn't stay silent. Some of the workers nodded. Others looked at him with quiet respect. One of the supervisors hesitated before speaking up. So what happens now, Henry? Henry took a deep breath. The factory stays open, he said firmly. No more unnecessary layoffs, no more treating people like numbers. We go back to running things the way they should be, like a family. A ripple of relief passed through the crowd. Then Henry did something no one expected. He turned to me. Linda, he said, I want you to help me. I blinked. Me? He nodded. You've been here long enough. You understand the people, the work, the heart of this place. I need someone who sees the workers as more than just employees, someone who actually cares. My heart pounded. I don't know what to say. Say yes, one of the workers whispered, grinning. I looked at Henry, then at everyone around me. And in that moment I realized, this factory wasn't just a job to me. It never had been. It was home. I smiled. Okay, yes. Henry nodded, satisfied. That day the factory didn't just get a new leader, it got its heart back. As for James, no one heard much about him after that. He left town, moved to a big city, probably still trying to prove himself in some corporate office. But the rest of us? We kept going. We worked hard, we stood by each other, and we built something better than before. And Henry? Well, he was exactly where he had always belonged. Right there beside us, not as a boss, but as one of us. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story and found it meaningful. If you did, please like, comment, and share to help spread the word. It really means a lot. And if you're not subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Your support makes all the difference and helps me create more stories for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. See you in the next one.